was hard to believe that someone could slip in and abduct a young woman right out of her bedroom without anybody hearing a thing. But that's what happened.
All right, so let's roll sound. And ABC.
We're good, Stephanie.
When we talk about the golden age of serial killers, it all started in the early to mid 70s with this group of 5. Like Gacy and 33 bodies under his house. Bundy traveling across the country. Raider terrorizing over decades and taunting law enforcement and the media. Jeffrey Dahmer, even today, we find his crimes to be on the extreme end of human behavior. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, confessed to 71 murders over the course of several decades.
5 of the most prolific serial killers in American history were all operating at the same time.
It was easy for us in hindsight to say, well, why didn't that person get caught, or why weren't people looking for them? I think we have to keep in mind historically the era.
In the 70s in the United States was an innocent sort of place.
You find this sort of trusting environment.
It was normal for people to just hang out with strangers and to hop into strange cars.
The murder of people in series has police departments across this country worried.
Law enforcement didn't have a definition for serial killers.
Those police officers back in the 70s just simply did not have the tools that law enforcement officers have now.
Being able to quickly run a name in a database, that's something that didn't exist.
There were no computers.
No internet.
No cell phones.
No DNA. There were no surveillance cameras.
Record keeping was in the back of everybody's drawer.
We didn't yet have the 911 system.
And these killers took full advantage of that.
John Wayne Gacy's
Ted Bundy is still alive.
BTK.
Jeffrey Dahmer.
The Green River Killer.
Georgianne Hawkins.
Stephen Toomey.
And he.
Catherine Bright.
Stephen Jonathan.
Jamie Douglas.
Terry Lawson.
Shirley Vian.
He took me by the shoulder and said, "Follow me." Threatened to kill me if I didn't comply.
I thought that he was just a normal man, and I was just thinking I'm gonna get home and everything's gonna be fine. Little did I know it was gonna be my worst nightmare.
We kept trying to tell him, but he's a kid. He's a kid. He said, well, he's telling us he's not a kid. So who should we believe? Believe the white guy.
These 5 killers don't come across to the outside world as frothing lunatics.
You could sit next to them on a bus or a train or a plane. You would never associate them with being the worst serial killers in U.S. history.
Deep down inside is a monster that you could never see.
My mother had told me that the only thing she ever prayed for herself was to die peacefully in her sleep. And that's the one thing she did not get.
Wichita was a very calm city, a city back in 1974 of roughly 300,000 people with a large agricultural base. We didn't think about crime. Nobody thought about crime. Crime happened in the big city. Crime did not happen in Wichita, Kansas.
My family was a loving, caring family of typical Americans. My mother and my father were childhood sweethearts. My mom was a good Catholic girl. That was why there was 5 of us, one after the other after the other. I remember walking home. I remember the snow being almost knee-deep. Opened up the back gate to the yard, and I saw my dog Lucky outside. So I said, "Hey, Lucky, what are you doing out here, boy? You okay? Come on." I opened up the kitchen door, and there was no sound, nobody. And so I was like, I yelled out, "Is anybody here?" And one of my siblings yelled out, "Charlie, come quick. Mom and Dad are playing a bad trick on us." I ran down the hall, went through the door in their bedroom, and saw my mom and my dad there tied up and dead. I could smell the fear and the pain that they had gone through. I could feel it all in the room. The physical pain is like if somebody pried your chest open.
Well, I confronted the family, pulled a pistol, confronted Mr. Otero. There I realized that I didn't have a mask on or anything. They already could ID me, and made a decision to go ahead and shut them down, I guess, or strangle them. I had never strangled anyone before, so I really didn't know how much pressure you had to put on a person or how long it would take.
The police had responded to the house. They opened a spare bedroom, and that's where they found Joey Jr.
The police believe that he sat in the chair and watched the child suffocate. And every time I think about that, it's tough, you know?
So then the search was on for Josephine. That's when the officers realized this house has a basement. And the officer went down there. He didn't know where the lights were. And he kind of sweeping his arm, trying to not bump into something. And he went against something that he thought was a punching bag hanging from the ceiling. And then when he found the light, it was Josephine, who had been hung from a sewer pipe in the basement of the house.
She will really struggle. And then as she struggles, he will describe masturbating.
If I'd have seen Joey and Josie, it might have drove me mad. Thank God I didn't see it. Thank God.
Crime scenes back in the 70s are not like they are now. The Otero crime scene, that is a crime scene that would never happen today. You had members of the media wandering through the house. You even had a higher-up official in the police department decide to make himself a drink of water. And so he had left the ice tray on the counter. And so people thought, well, the ice hadn't melted completely, so that must have been the killer who did it.
Back in 1974, we couldn't even spell DNA. The technology didn't exist back then. But at Josephine's feet, there was a pool. The crime scene investigator had incredible imagination because he didn't know what it was. He didn't know what its value was, but he knew he wanted to preserve it. So he took a pillowcase and he cut it up into several small pieces, and then he dipped it in that pool. 31 years later, a genetic profile would be drawn from one of those preserved pieces of evidence.
The police department thought at first that this was a drug murder. They took several people into custody. It turned out they weren't related to the case at all.
In 1974, the idea that someone would kill for pleasure was unheard of. It just wasn't something that existed in anyone's mind.
There had to be some motive. Why does somebody just pick out this family and slaughter 4 people? And so a lot of opinions were sought from the psychologists of the day, thinking that they would have some insight as to what would motivate a person to do this.
Dennis Rader, as a child, had a perfectly normal upbringing. He said, I was never abused. Everything was normal in my family. But then he says, I knew from a young age that I had Factor X. Factor X is the demon inside of me, he says, that caused me to have to torture people and kill people.
Can you pinpoint when you knew that there was a problem coming?
Well, I would say probably even when I was in probably grade school, I sort of had some problems.
And what kind of problems were those?
All males probably go through some kind of sexual fantasies. Mine was just a little bit weirder than other people.
Rader will describe a specific incident when he was a kid where he was at some kind of family outing and they tied a chicken to a tree stump in order to kill the chicken. And the tying of the chicken to that stump caused him to have what he would describe as sexual feelings.
Anyway, I think somewhere along the line I knew, probably by the time I was in 8th grade, but it exploded on January 15th, 1974. That's when the volcano exploded.
Dennis Rader was cultivating this persona of churchgoer. He was married. He was relatively young. He was 28 years old, relatively handsome. So he should have everything going for him. And so when he loses this job in 1973, things weren't perfect. He was not in control. And some ways that people may try to overcorrect for that is by gaining control in some other aspect of their life. And, you know, perhaps it triggered his need to control something or someone.
When the Otero family was killed, the way he tells it, he was between jobs, was bored, didn't feel good about himself, so Factor X came out.
When you look back at the first known kills for these 5 serial killers, you have to understand that they have been fantasizing about killing for a long time. It starts with developing victim profiles in their head, where they would get these victims, how they would control them. Rader's life centered around a lot of fantasy, but you can only fantasize so long before you cross that line. And that was the case with John Wayne Gacy.
In my mind, John Gacy was the worst kind of a killer you can imagine. You know, like a shark swimming around down there. He would lay his eyes on somebody walking down the street, and in his mind, that person was dead. John Gacy frequented homosexual areas in Chicago. There was a couple of areas, one called Bughouse Square and the other called Boys Town. He patrolled down there. I mean, he would go around the block looking for somebody to pick up. He had a black Oldsmobile with a spotlight on the driver's side. He had some phony badges. A lot of the kids that he picked up, a lot of them were homosexuals. Many of them he took to his house. In many of them, there was a one-way trip.
Gacy picked up 16-year-old Timothy Jack McCoy at the Greyhound bus station.
According to Gacy, what happens is he offered him money for sex. But he got him back to his house, Gacy's house. He was in bed. They did what they did with one another.
He wakes up in the morning, and the kid's standing at the foot of his bed with a big butcher knife in his hand. And he thinks the kid's coming after him to attack him. He jumps out of bed, fights with him, takes the knife away from him, and stabbed him in the heart twice. Killed him.
What's interesting about this is that for most normal people, you would probably call somebody because now you've just killed somebody. And Gacy reports being aroused and orgasming in this most intense way.
Goes into the kitchen, and there the kid's been preparing breakfast. He was slicing the bacon. These are Gacy's words, but he said that he probably wanted to know how thick I wanted my bacon sliced. But unfortunately, he didn't take it that way at the time, and he says defended himself and killed him. Buried him in the crawl space.
This is when Gacy crosses over, when he has his first kill. And now he recognizes the powerful arousal component of controlling somebody's life, essentially playing God, deciding whether they live or die. And that's where he then starts this collection of young men who he tortures as a sexual sadist and eventually kills. So when we look back at serial killers, we're typically looking for a triggering event. But in Gacy's life, there was, I think, a series of things that were going on.
John Gacy was given the middle name of Wayne. His father wanted his son to be this tough guy named after this hero cowboy, just like John Wayne. Well, when his son wanted to spend more time with his mother and do more gardening, Gacy's father would verbally assault, emotionally assault, and physically assault John Wayne Gacy.
John Wayne Gacy, around the age of 4 or 5, is at home upstairs with a neighbor girl who was much older than him, a teenage girl. And apparently she was fondling his genitals or touching him in sort of a sexual way. Well, both mothers come upstairs and discover this. The mother of the girl strikes her in front of Gacy. A moment like this is really significant in that you have sexuality being joined with shame, being joined with physical aggression. A combination like that would produce someone who is capable of acting in a way that is both sexual and aggressive and shame-inducing. And that's exactly what John Wayne Gacy did.
I was molested when I was a boy. It's hard to think back on and admit it ever happened. It takes away from your how you look at yourself as a male. And that was part of the reason I never told anybody for all those decades. When I was 9 or 10 years old, in 1956, my mother and I went up to a resort in Elkhorn, Wisconsin. A fellow named John, he was about 16. He worked there. He did odd jobs. I didn't have any buddies up there to spend time with, and so he befriended me. He had some time off, and he wanted to know if I want to go in a boat with him. So he took me out in a boat. I'd never been in a rowboat before, so that was fun for a little 9 or 10-year-old boy. We tied up the boat. He took me in the thicket, and he did a terrible thing. He did a terrible thing. He took me by the shoulder and said, "Follow me," threatened to kill me if I didn't comply. And I turned around. He said, "Open your mouth." I opened my mouth. And that's what happened. Thank God it was over quickly. It was over quickly. Is a person born evil? Do they become evil? I don't have an answer for that.
Serial sexual killers do not snap at 30 years of age and become serial killers. It evolves over time, and that time begins when they're quite young. As that desire for these violent sexual fantasies continue, offenders can look for more and more opportunities to satisfy those urges and compulsions.
In the 1960s, Gacy started edging closer and closer to murder. He had sexual relations with teenagers, underage kids. This was his MO out there. One of these young kids was Donald Voorhees Jr. He was the son of a state representative in Iowa. Gacy would show him some stag films. They did have sexual acts together numerous times.
When the boy finally told his father what had happened, his father went right to the state police and demanded that Gacy be arrested and tried.
He was charged with sodomy of a 15-year-old boy.
So they threw the book at him. He got the maximum, 10 years.
I'm John Gacy. I'm from Waterloo, Iowa.
And you're a man of some authority here. What is your title?
Well, I'm first cook in the kitchen.
Gacy was not only a model prisoner at Anamosa, he almost seemed to run the prison. The parole board looked at Gacy's actions within the prison and said, well, okay, he could probably be a model citizen. Let's release him. Out of his 10-year sentence, Gacy only served 18 months.
In the 1970s, there was no such thing as a sex offender registry. It just didn't exist. So essentially, Gacy is allowed to go to Chicago and begin his life with a clean slate.
If Gacy had served his full sentence, that would have brought about one of the great ironies of and sad ironies of this case, meaning that 33 young lives would not be gone.
The case stands out because it was so brazen. I mean, there were other roommates in the home at the time. No one heard anything. It's hard to believe that someone could slip in and abduct a young woman right out of her bedroom without anybody hearing a thing. But that's what happened.
In 1974, there was a new freedom for women. Law schools, medical schools, were forced to admit women and people of color, and it was about time. It was a time when you could aspire to anything.
In 1974, Ted Bundy was a graduate of the University of Washington, and he was attending law school, but living in the University of Washington district. He wanted to be a famous lawyer. He wanted to be a politician. He was trying to become an up-and-comer among people he admired.
Linda Healy, she was a University of Washington student who was abducted from her basement bedroom. She just disappeared without a trace.
Linda Healy lived off campus in a house with some of her girlfriends, and her apartment was in the basement.
Her roommates hadn't seen her for a day or two, and finally one of them went down and went into her room. And it looked like she hadn't been there. Her bed was perfectly made. They spotted some blood, though, and opened a closet and found a nightgown that had blood on it.
She was missing. Nobody knew where she went. Linda was just gone. The crime scene, the place where Linda Ann Healy disappeared from, was processed to some extent by the Seattle Police Department.
We didn't have crime scene technicians. We didn't have digital cameras. And I remember my lieutenant telling me, You have film, it's expensive. You're using flash bulbs, they're expensive. Don't take a lot of pictures. So crime scenes, you know, even homicide crime scenes might only have like 20 or 30 pictures. You know, and today we have hundreds.
There weren't any particular suspects at this point. That was kind of a one-off case.
It was the beginning of, you know, that series of young women disappearing from college campuses and other areas around the Pacific Northwest.
Our son is the best son in the world. He's a very normal, active boy. Yeah, did all the things that most boys like to do.
Ted Bundy was known to have had a very unusual childhood. He was considered an illegitimate birth. The mother was not married at the time. And then he was raised for the first few years of his life in the home of his maternal grandparents.
Ted Bundy was brought up on the assumption that his grandparents are his parents and his mother is his sister. He's sort of brought into this world or web of lies and starts forming, you know, his personality based on this family dynamic that is really an unhealthy dynamic.
I knew Ted Bundy from the time I was 5 until I was 15. My brother was Ted's age, so most of the boys hung out together, and I was the tag-along little sister. My brother told me very early on to stay clear of Ted. He was just a mean-spirited kid. Ted liked building holes in the ground with sharp stakes pointing up, and then he'd make this big thing of leaves and sticks and twigs so you couldn't tell that it was there. And one of the girls from a couple streets up went through one and got the whole side of her leg gashed up really bad. He liked that. He liked scaring people, especially little girls, and he liked hurting them. And he liked hurting animals that were small and helpless. There was a cat in our neighborhood that was hanging from a clothesline, and it was on fire. He'd lit it up with gasoline, with lighter fluid, and set it on fire, and you could hear that cat screaming. It was horrible.
In terms of the 5 serial killers we're discussing, animal cruelty may be sort of a practice run for violence and aggression against humans. If an individual has the capacity to harm an animal, it's really not much more of a leap for them to harm another human being. We certainly see it with Ridgway, we certainly see it with Rader, the same with Gacy, and then Bundy.
His behavior spoke very loudly of who he was. And I doubt if any of the people in the neighborhood were surprised when Ted was killing women.
By the time Ted Bundy was a young teenager, he was shoplifting, he was lying, he was a peeping Tom in Tacoma neighborhoods when he was 14 or so. He applied to the University of Washington and started attending. And he learned in a psychology class that people will help somebody who appears vulnerable.
Prior to Ted Bundy's first kill, we want to look at what's going on in his life. He'd been dating a woman named Stephanie Brooks.
Stephanie Brooks represented everything that he wanted, but really just couldn't achieve on his own. Upper class life, access, beauty, and being with her, he had those things by proxy.
So Bundy's low view of himself was really elevated by dating Stephanie Brooks. until Stephanie broke up with him. This was a real turning point for Bundy. It was devastating for him. He felt abandoned, he felt betrayed. And it's at this point when Bundy, who has been fantasizing over a long period of time, actually decides he's going to act out and try to capture his first victim.
In Bundy's case, it's often discussed how his victims had a physical similarity to the woman that broke his heart, basically, and that perhaps in that regard it might have been more revenge or retribution or along that lines.
He was so angry at her for breaking it off that this entity in him, this compulsion to kill, would take over. He really couldn't control his impulses anymore. A few years later, Linda Ann Healy was killed.
There's something about the first kill that might have served a particular psychological purpose that they might have become addicted to. You see this with Bundy, and you see this with Dennis Rader.
After the Otero murders, police were really baffled. They had absolutely no suspects at all. 3 months after the Otero murders, Dennis Rader decided he was going to kill again.
This time it's a Wichita State student, Catherine Bright.
Dennis saw Catherine Bright, and he decided that she would be his next victim. And so for the next several weeks, he stalked her.
But he didn't plan for her little brother to be at the residence.
Broke into the house and waited for her to come home. She and Kevin Bright came in. I wasn't expecting him to be there. They got out of hand.
While he's in there, he ties them both up, and then Kevin gets his feet loose and he attacks Dennis Rader. This is totally unexpected, not in Dennis Rader's plan at all.
He broke his bonds and he jumped up real quick like. I pulled my gun and quickly shot him. Hit him in the head. He fell over. I could see the blood, and as far as I'm concerned, I thought he was down.
At that point, the killer makes his way back over to Catherine. There's quite a struggle with her. At some point during that struggle, a knife comes out, and Catherine is stabbed multiple times with quite a bit of ferocity. Kevin still survived, and Kevin runs out the front door.
The front door of the house was open, and he was gone. What I thought the police were coming at that time. I heard the door open. I thought, no, that's it.
Kevin Bright runs out, runs to a convenience store across the street, and the police are called.
And I stepped out there, and I could see him running down the street, so I quickly cleaned up everything that I could and left.
By the time officers arrive, Catherine is on the floor right outside her kitchen. An officer asked her initially, do you know who did this to you? And she says no. That's really the last communication she makes. She's taken and they try to save her life for several hours, but she dies later that day.
He should have been caught, but he wasn't. And that's why in the future kills, he wanted to be very careful to make sure, A, no man was involved, no dog was involved, that everything went better.
The description that came from Kevin Bright pretty much matches Dennis Rader. However, the description didn't do much good. They're looking for a loner. They're looking for a criminal. They're looking for someone out of the ordinary.
They were looking for somebody that had a reason to commit these murders. And even though Dennis Rader's right in their sight, He is a churchgoer. He is, well known in the community. They don't see him because they don't see him as somebody who could do something like that.
It stayed a big news story for a long time. There was a lot of follow-up on it, and there was some consternation when they couldn't find the killer, and that became a secondary news story. Is the police department doing its job? Why haven't they caught the guy? What are the leads?
Now you have 5 homicides in Wichita, Kansas within a few months of one another.
When we look at law enforcement capability, we have to understand that they didn't have the technological advances that we have today to detect or even make connections between homicide cases. Particularly in BTK's example, Wichita, Kansas in the 70s, small town, small police force. They're not used to dealing with homicide cases. They're not trained in that way.
In the early days, nobody linked Catherine Bright and her brother to the Otero murder. There were maybe some similarities, but everybody thought that these were just individual murders. We had no idea that it was going to turn into something huge and really something monstrous.
By the spring of 1974, Ted Bundy's MO was going to college campuses where he fit in. I mean, he looked like a student. Well, at that time, college campuses were a safe place. A young woman on a campus wouldn't think twice about walking from the library late at night to her dorm room. And of course, parents obviously wanted to send their children to someplace safe.
Sue was a dream child, very ambitious. All she wanted from the time she was tiny was to go to school. Mothers have a certain second sense when it comes to their children. She was boarding the airplane. She turned around and she looked at me. And she just gave a little wave. And I told my husband, I'll never see her again. Sue was loving everything about college life. She was so happy there. This was her dream and her destiny. She had made arrangements to meet another dorm mate, and when she didn't come back from that meeting, her roommate knew immediately that something was wrong. So they called the campus police.
For her not to come home was just not right. She just wouldn't do that kind of thing. She just wouldn't. Well, first of all, it was unexpected.
When my husband told me, I just had this uneasy feeling. He said, Sue's missing, and they can't find her. And I said, no, she's dead. It was a different world. We didn't have computers or DNA or Amber Alerts. And the police departments were not coordinating with each other. And we were out there buying ads in the Seattle paper, have you seen this child?
In a lot of the cases, at first involving Ted Bundy, people sometimes speculated that, oh, well, the girl is just off on her own, or maybe she's spending a couple nights with a new boyfriend. In the 70s, the concept of a serial killer was something that people pretty much attributed to a horror movie. So there wasn't a really good understanding about that concept.
At one point, someone asked my husband, Aren't you going to feel silly when she shows up married to somebody? And I think that kind of was the mentality back then. It's a different mentality now. Thank goodness.
During the first half of 1974, there were a series of murders, about one a month, pretty much of the same age. They looked very similar to one another, and they lived similar lifestyles as young women in their 20s lived. Ted Bundy's MO was to try and get women to trust him and go with him. He was the kind of person that could talk a young woman into helping him, a stranger. He was looking for the empathetic female so he could overpower her and ultimately kill her.
The night she disappeared, she walked across campus and he was standing at the library, which she had to walk in front of to get to her dorm, with his arm in a sling. And he called to her and asked her to help carry his books. Could you help me to my car? It's just over there. We teach our children to be compassionate, and to be helpful, and to reach out to those that are disabled. And that, you know, were we wrong to bring her up that way? I don't think so. It's so important for them to care for others. And that's what happened. She helped him.
Contrary to what we might think, serial killers don't come across to the outside world as frothing lunatics.
We are not some kind of inherent monsters. We are your sons and we are your husbands.
Dennis Rader had a BTK side and he had a Dennis Rader, the family man side. He much preferred the BTK side.
With guys like Bundy, you have a success, and then another, and then another. And pretty soon, you start to believe you're invincible.
John Wayne Gacy built carefully an entire life to live a facade of duality.
My brother says me and this boy are working together and we're digging around Gacy's house. Well, it ended up they were digging their own graves.